Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. On the bench today, as you may be able to see behind me here, we have the door trim to my KitchenAid microwave. So the problem with this, as you may be able to see, is that the handle has pulled right out of the door. Taking a look at the top of the handle, you can see that the screw and washer pulled straight out of the plastic and left a big hole and a crack in it here. So you can see that the bottom part of the handle broke and the boss where the screw goes into kind of stayed in the door along with the screw. What I think I'm going to do is try and glue this back together as best I can to at least get it functional again. It may not be quite as pretty as it was when it left the factory, but it ought to work. Before I get started with gluing this up, why don't you guys take a look at what I had to do to get it disassembled. Here's what the microwave looks in my kitchen above the stove. You can see the handle is already falling off at this point, and you see it comes right out. The screw stayed in the top of the handle, and the bottom of the handle kind of broke apart, and the screw and the piece of plastic from the handle stayed inside the door. So I can still open it up, just by pulling on the bottom there, as you can see. Now here's a look at the door frame itself, and you can see the way that it's made doesn't lend itself to be taken apart real easily. So I think what we're going to have to do is pry the white plastic outer trim away from the inner frame. So you can see here, to do the prying, I got a hold of a small flathead screwdriver, and I'm just going to gently insert that between the white trim and the black door frame and just start kind of exploring and prying and seeing what's in there. Now, as I started to get in there, I could see that there were some tabs on the white plastic trim that I just had to kind of gently pry out of the way. And what I ended up finding worked best is when I was able to kind of locate one of those plastic clips, I kind of inserted the screwdriver into the clip and pushed towards the front of the door and down at the same time, all while trying to make sure that I didn't crack that white trim any worse than it already was. And right about here you can see I finally got it completely free of the door frame, and I was able to pull it the rest of the way away from the microwave, just being careful not to drop it or crack the glass. Now we have to get the black plastic inner trim away from the metal door frame. And that's just held on with some regular plastic clips, and you can see I'm using my screwdriver here to just pry those away from the little nooks that they're engaged in. Now this side was a whole lot easier to remove because I had access to the clips, and as you can see as I went around I was able to not only see them, but I was able to just use my fingers to pull them away from the door frame. So you can see here I'm just getting the last few clips from the inside of the door frame, and the inner plastic comes right out. And as you can see, that inner trim piece had no damage. It was perfectly intact. It's a slightly different, more pliable plastic than the outer trim, so it was a little easier to work with. One thing I want to show is that there were holes in the door frame that accepted screws that went into the white plastic. And you can see there's one left in the door frame there. Now the two that are on the inner side of the door near the hinge didn't have screws in them. And the one that's at the bottom, the screw fell out because the boss and the plastic had all broken apart and disintegrated. Now I'm not exactly sure how the factory got those screws in there. They must have put the white trim on first and then somehow put that black plastic in. But there was no way to disassemble it the same way. the white trim had to come off first because there was no way to disengage those clips on the black inner plastic in order to get it out to have access to those screws. So in other words, this microwave was designed for easy assembly, but not so easy disassembly. So I've got these two products that I think I'm going to use for this job. The first one is this Loctite 2-part plastic epoxy. I've used this on many things in the past and it works great. But for this particular part of the project, I think I'm going to set this stuff aside and use my Loctite super glue. This stuff also works pretty good. It's not quite as high strength as the 2-part epoxy, but it seems to hold up pretty well. Here's a look at the back of the door surround. You can see the white trim, and then there's some sealing foam here and some foam here to protect the edge of the front glass here. Now underneath this piece of foam you can see the head of the screw that stayed in the door, so I'm going to try and take that out. I guess I'm going to have to try and hold that plastic from the front if I can. So here's a look at the back of the handle and the piece of plastic that came out of the screw I just removed. And this would have went in here somewhere, and there's other little bits of plastic that are missing now, so it's going to be hard to glue that back together. But I've got a plan for that, but we're going to set this aside for now and focus on just the door for the moment. So I'm going to draw your attention over here, and you may be able to see that there is a piece of black plastic with a screw in it. And what this is a little clip that holds the glass in place on this side. Now you may also be able to notice that there is the remnants of one of these clip mounts right here. You can see that the boss in the plastic where the screw would have went into is missing. In the debris pile that came out of this thing when I took it apart, I found the second clip. As you can see here, the screw is still in it. And if I flip it over on the back, you can see the white plastic is still more or less intact as it came off of the face here. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do is glue this piece back in where it came from, and that'll help support the glass in the frame. So I'm just going to hold pressure on this for about 30 seconds or so, and then I should be good to go. I was going to try and clamp it with a clamp, but I can't seem to get a clamp in there at the right angle, and I think it'll put more lateral force on this and do more damage than it would do good. I'm going to let this set up for a little while before I start working on any of these other cracks, just so that I don't flex this and pop it out of there prematurely before the glue fully dries. I ended up letting this sit overnight, and it seems pretty solid now. I think that glue is going to work okay on this plastic. So I think the next part that I'm going to glue is this part here. Now in this location there was also one of these hold down clips, which I managed to find, so we'll probably want to try and glue that back on if we can too. Now because this will be on the bottom of the door, I don't have to be real fussy with the squeeze out or anything like that, so if there's a little bit of a bead there when I'm done, it's not really going to be visible. So I think that's starting to set up now, and you can see here the crack is still visible, but I didn't get a ton of squeeze out on this side. Did get a little on this side, but like I said, that'll be okay because it's not going to be visible in here. So I'm going to let that set up for a little while before I start fiddling with this clip. Okay, so this crack has kind of set up now to the point where I can kind of manipulate this a little bit. Now I said I was going to work on these clips, but I decided instead of working on these clips first, I'm going to take care of this crack that's right here that you can see. As I kind of move the trim apart, you can see that crack open up a little bit. Now the other thing that I've done is I've put the door up on these old magazines to just raise it up off the table. And the reason for that is that this crack here is on the back of the front face of the door. And if I get a little bit of seep out, it's going to end up seeping through and gluing my plastic to the table. I don't really want that to happen. Now, of course, I want to try and minimize the amount of squeeze out I'm getting in here anyway, just so it's not visible, or as visible as it could be once I get this glued. So I think we'll just give this a shot and see what I can do. I'm going to try and get more glue here on this rib than sort of on those faces, although I am going to put a little bit there to just try and minimize the cracking. I've let this joint set up for a little while, so it should be somewhat firmed up now. So while I'm on a roll, I think I'm going to work on the bad crack over here. So again, this one here is cracked from the front face all the way clear up through the side. Now, I'm not too worried about squeeze out on the side or anything like that, but I'm going to try and minimize the amount of glue that I have to use on this surface so that I don't get squeeze out on the front. We'll see what happens. As you can see, I've got everything glued up here, and this is set up overnight, so it's been about 22 hours or so since I put the glue on. And you can see here that on the front the cracks are still visible. I didn't really get too much squeeze out, just one little blob there, so that's manageable. I think the handle is going to cover that anyway. And then this crack that's down here, I think you guys can see it. This one here is glued, but it's not real visible. There's no squeeze out there. So what I think I'm going to do now is take my plastic epoxy and I'm going to build up this area on the top part of the handle with some epoxy. I checked the clearance on the door frame up at the microwave, and there should be some room in here to build this up. I don't have to worry about clearances. But I want to try and build this crack up a little bit here, this one here that's sort of on the front face, just to give this a little extra rigidity. But I do have to be careful with the clearance here, as it fits kind of tightly against the door frame and the other piece of plastic I have over there that kind of holds this thing all together. Okay, so let's mix up some of this plastic epoxy and get it applied over here. I'm just going to use this Altoid tray as my mixing surface. I'm going to flip it over. Okay, we'll start with that much. Let's start with this and see if it's enough. Mix it up good and thoroughly so that we get a good mix. Okay, so I got a blob here, and whoops, I wasn't watching what I was doing, so I've got to be careful, but I'm going to spread that in and just try and build up this plastic a bit. I've got all of the cracks coated with at least a little bit of epoxy. Up here I've got a fair amount in this area because this is where the most heavy cracking is. And I've also got some along the back of this crack that's here to help reinforce that. And then I had a little bit left over, so I spread it kind of thinly on this crack on the edge. Now this plastic edge does fit kind of tightly against the door frame and the other piece of plastic, so I want to be careful I don't create too much topography there, but I think a little bit of a bump isn't going to hurt too much. But I'm going to spread that just a little more while we're talking. I don't know if having this on here is really going to help at all, but I don't think it can hurt. And I already had the extra product mixed, so I figured, yeah, I'll use it on there. So anyway, let's let this cure. I think we'll let it cure overnight again, and we'll come back tomorrow and we'll use the same epoxy to glue the handle onto the front of this. So we're back at it again. 24 hours or so has passed since I put the epoxy on, and everything seems like it's hardened up pretty good and seems to be holding pretty good too. So let's flip it over and take a look at putting the handle on. The way the handle came off of the trim piece here is that this part of the handle stayed intact with the screw in it and pulled out of the plastic on the microwave door. Whereas the other end of it, the handle part broke and the door itself stayed intact. So what I think I'm going to try and do is flip the handle over and put the intact handle end with the intact door end like that, so that I can use the screw to hold that together. And then up at this end, what I think I'm going to do is use some more of my plastic epoxy and just epoxy the handle to the trim. I've got the handle screwed on down here, but it's still free up here, of course, since everything is still broken. I've put a mark here with a marker so that I know where the end of the handle will be. And what I'm going to do now is rough up this surface with some sandpaper. This plastic is very smooth and probably won't adhere good to the epoxy, so putting a little bit of a tooth on it with the sandpaper, so to speak, will help the epoxy bond better to the plastic. So now that I've got that roughed in, I'm actually going to remove my blue line with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol here, just because once I get some epoxy on there, it may squeeze out a little bit and cover that line, and then I wouldn't have been able to get it off at all. So let's get the epoxy back out, mix up a batch, and see what we can do. Now comes the fun part. Let's see if I can make this into a bloody mess. I'm going to pick this up a little bit, not so much that I break the screw on the other end, but I'm going to swing it over, and I'm going to take a look. And it looks like I could probably add a little bit down here as well. Now I know I didn't scuff that up, but we'll take our chances. Now on this other side, there's no plastic on the handle left, but I'll put a little there just so I have it. And I guess maybe I'll just fill that hole in with the rest of this. Not that it'll do anything, but I'll just use it in there. Okay, let's try this again. Bring it back over, line it up, and I'll push it down in place. Okay, so I'm not getting too much squeeze out. I tried to keep my epoxy towards the inside of the handle if I could. Now the problem with this stuff is it takes a while to set up, unlike the super glue, which only takes 30 or 40 seconds. So I'm not going to sit here for an hour and hold this. I'm going to have to find a way to try and keep pressure on this while the epoxy sets up. This is going to be a little bit unorthodox, but I've got my old Drake RV3. This is a VFO power supply and external speaker for an old Drake ham radio. But the nice thing about this is it's pretty heavy. So what I'm going to do is I want to balance this on the handle with its heavy side on the handle, making sure that I don't crack the glass of the door here. But I'm going to let that sit on the handle. It'll kind of stay perched there. So this has all been sitting here for about a day and a half now, setting up and curing. So we're probably safe to remove this and take a look and see how the handle is. So you may be able to see I did end up getting a little bit of squeeze out there. So it looks like the handle wandered on me a little bit, which I kind of expected it might, just because of the way I was holding it down with that radio. That really wasn't ideal, but it didn't move much. It's a little bit crooked and there's a little bit squeeze out of there, but it should be okay. I think it'll be usable. So now I'm just going to put these pieces of trim back that I disturbed, and we should be good to start assembly. So here I've got the outer door trim, and I'm just kind of fitting that around the metal door frame and sort of clipping it into place with those white tabs. Those will lock into some holes that are in the metal frame. Next up, I'm going to take the original screw that came out of the door and put that back into the door frame through the boss that wasn't broken, or the one that I re-glued rather, on the front trim. So now I'm going to take a longer screw that I got from my junk box and put that in place where the bottom screw was. And what that'll do is that'll catch the remaining part of the plastic boss that is left and at least give me a little bit of retention force on that screw. It's not ideal, but it ought to work. So now it's time to insert that inner black plastic trim piece. You can see that it just fits in between the outer white trim and the metal door frame, and just clips in to some holes that are in the metal frame. So just get it oriented the right way and just snap it into place. Very easy assembly for the factory, not so easy to disassemble once it's all together. Okay, so that's just about it. It looks like everything is now working the way that it should. The handle feels nice and tight. We're able to open and close the door with a normal amount of force, and the handle isn't falling off. Now visually, there's a little bit of glue squeeze out up at the top of the handle, and the crack up at the top is still a little bit visible if you're looking closely enough at it. And of course the handle ended up getting a little bit crooked on me. So all things considered, I think this went okay. Well, that's going to wrap up repairing the door on my KitchenAid microwave. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. Thanks for watching.